Across the galaxy, there were countless species that had learned the hard way what happens when you underestimate the creatures from a small, blue planet. Humanity had never been the strongest. They had never been the fastest or the smartest. Their bodies broke easily. Their lifespans were laughably short compared to the ancients who had walked among the stars for millions of years. But there was something about humans that every species eventually discovered, usually far too late to do anything about it. They were the only creatures in the known universe that would burn everything down, including themselves, just to make sure their enemies burned first. They would sacrifice their own children for victory. They would forget what peace meant. They would turn into something so terrifying that even the most powerful warlords would warn their successors, never wake a sleeping dragon. Humanity was that dragon. And, in the story you are about to read, that dragon was about to open its eyes. Commander Krell stood at the observation deck of the Valerian flagship, watching the pale blue dot grow larger in the viewport. The Valerian Empire had ruled this sector for 3,000 years, and they had done it through strength, honor, and absolute dominance. Krell himself was one of the most respected military commanders in the Empire, a being who had personally conquered 17 star systems. His scales shimmered with the metallic sheen of victory, and his 6 eyes reflected the cold light of distant stars. He had heard of Earth before most commanders had. It was a funny little planet where primitive creatures had only recently discovered space travel. The species was called human, and they were considered more of a curiosity than a threat. "Commander, we are receiving a distress signal from the human colony on Kepler 442b, reported Officer Vax, his voice steady and professional. The Kepler colony was technically not Valerian territory, but it was in their sphere of influence. No colony could survive without Valerian protection, so in essence, everything in this region belonged to the Empire." "What kind of distress signal?" Krell asked, already knowing the answer would be insignificant. "Probably a technical failure. Maybe a solar flare." The humans were so fragile that anything could go wrong in their primitive habitats. "An attack, sir. Incoming vessels of unknown origin. The humans are requesting immediate military support." Krell turned away from the viewport, his expression unreadable. "What could possibly attack them that would require our intervention?" "Send a single patrol vessel to investigate. This is beneath our attention." Officer Vex hesitated. That hesitation would change everything. "Sir, the humans are claiming the attack is coming from the Zool territories." "The Zool?" Now that was interesting. The Zool were a neighboring power, less sophisticated than the Valorians but growing stronger. Krell had been waiting for an excuse to push back against their expansion. This could be the perfect opportunity. But the humans were making a claim about who was attacking them, which meant they wanted the Valorians to believe this was an act of aggression by the Zool against Valerian interests. "Send the patrol vessel," Krell said, turning back to face the stars. "But tell the humans they should have called us sooner. And tell them to survive for at least the next 6 hours. If they cannot do that, then they were not worthy of our protection anyway." On Kepler 442b, the situation was far more desperate than the Valerian command understood. The human colony numbered approximately 15,000 people. They lived in sealed habitats beneath the planet's toxic surface, and they had no weapons that could effectively combat the sleek, advanced warships that were currently tearing through their defenses. The colony commander was a woman named Sarah Chen, and she was only 32 years old. She had been sent to this colony as a civilian administrator, not a military officer, but the moment the attack began, she had become something else entirely, a soldier defending her people's survival. "Status report," she shouted into her communication device as explosions rocked the agricultural dome around her. The dome was designed to grow food in the harsh Colopian environment. It was not designed to withstand military bombardment. "We've lost the eastern habitat," reported Colonel James Martinez, the commander of the colony's small security force. "We have maybe 50 soldiers here, and they're throwing at us advanced plasma weaponry. We're losing people every second." Sarah made a decision that would echo across human space. She accessed the emergency transmission protocols and sent a message directly to the Valerian flagship. The message was simple and brutal: Valerian Empire, I am Commander Saracen of Earth Colony Kepler 442b. We are under attack. We call upon you to honor your protection treaties. If you do not respond, we will assume you have abandoned us. We will then assume you are allied with our attackers. We will assume your empire is actively engaged in an act of war against humanity. And we will respond accordingly. Most Valerian commanders would have laughed at the message. A tiny human colony threatening the might of the Valerian Empire? Ridiculous. But Krell did not laugh. Krell understood psychology. He understood that humans, despite their weakness, had one quality that made them unpredictable: they had nothing to lose. And a species with nothing to lose was a species that would do dangerous things. Send 3 destroyer-class vessels immediately, he commanded. And route a military fleet to the human homeworld. Full defensive posture. If the humans are making these kinds of threats, they believe they are at war. We need to show them the difference between their little colony and a real military power. The Valerian response came fast. Within 2 hours, 3 massive destroyers emerged from hyperspace near Kepler 442b, their weapons systems screaming to life. The Zool vessels that had been attacking the colony broke off immediately, fleeing toward the border of their own territory. The Valerian commander of the destroyer squadron was named Threll, and he was young and ambitious. He saw the retreating Zool vessels and made the decision that would ignite a war that would span multiple galaxies. Instead of stopping at the colony to ensure the humans were safe, he pursued the Zool vessels across the border and opened fire, destroying 2 of them without warning or negotiation. The 3rd Zool vessel escaped, but the message was clear: the Valorians had just attacked the Zool Empire without provocation. Back on Earth, the news of the attack on Kepler 442b was spreading through human society like a virus. The colony had been lost. 3,000 people had died before the Valorians arrived. 3,000 more had died in the chaos of the planetary evacuation. But it was Saracen's last transmission that mattered most. In her final message, said as she was boarding one of the last escape vessels, she had said something that every human government needed to hear: we were not strong enough to survive. But Earth will be. Earth will make sure of it. We didn't die. We were murdered. In the human government headquarters on Earth, the Council of Nations met in emergency session. The room was silent for a long moment as the reality of the situation sank in. For the first time in human history, they were being attacked by an alien power. The Valerian Empire had failed to protect them, and the colony had been slaughtered. This was not an isolated incident that could be negotiated or compromised on. This was an existential threat. This was the moment that would separate human history into before and after. The first person to speak was Admiral Marcus Yang, the commander of the human Space Force. We have 7 carrier battle groups currently in operation, he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he was about to suggest. Combined with our defense stations and fighter squadrons, we can field approximately 4,000 combat vessels. It is not much compared to what we know about the Valerian fleet, but it is what we have. We are not at war with the Valorians, said Secretary General David Okonkwo, the political leader of Earth. The Valorians protected us, even if they arrived late. The Zool were our attackers. With respect, sir, Admiral Yang replied, that does not matter anymore. The Kepler colony was Earth territory. 3,000 of our people were killed. The Valorians failed their protection treaty, and now we have a choice. We can accept that we are weak and vulnerable, or we can show the galaxy that attacking Earth has consequences. Saracen watched the news broadcast from the evacuation vessel as it made its way back to Earth. She watched Earth's politicians and military leaders debate what to do. And she knew what they would decide, because she knew humanity. Humans did not forgive weakness in themselves. Humans did not accept victimhood. Humans became something else when they were threatened. They became dangerous. The Valerian Empire, meanwhile, was facing an unexpected crisis. The destruction of the Zool vessels had triggered a diplomatic incident that was quickly spiraling into military confrontation. The The Zool had demanded an apology and reparations. The Valorians, seeing this as an opportunity to finally crush their rivals, had instead sent a massive fleet mobilizing toward the Zool borders. What Krell did not expect was what the humans were about to do. 3 days after the attack on Kepler 442b, Earth transmitted a formal declaration to the Valerian Empire. The message was short and written in the careful language of military protocol, but the meaning was unmistakable. The human civilization of Earth holds the Valerian Empire responsible for the destruction of our colony and the deaths of our citizens. We demand immediate reparations and a full investigation into your failure to honor your protection treaty. If these demands are not met within 72 hours, the human species will consider this a declaration of war. We will respond to war with everything we have. We ask you to reconsider what that means. When Krell received the message, he actually did laugh. The humans were threatening war. The humans, a species that had not even been in space for more than a century, were threatening to go to war with one of the most powerful empires in galactic history. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing that would have been funny if it was not so pathetic. But there was something else in the message that disturbed him. There was something in the way the humans had written it that suggested they understood something about themselves that the Valorians had overlooked. They knew they were weak. They knew their technology was inferior. They knew their military was tiny compared to the Valerian forces. And yet they still made the threat. That kind of confidence in the face of impossible odds was not something Krell had encountered before. Run a complete analysis of human military capabilities, he ordered. I want to know everything. Their weapons systems, their tactics, their strategies, their supply chains, their manufacturing capacity. Everything. The analysis took 16 hours. When it was complete, Krell read through the entire report in silence. When he was finished, he did something he rarely did. He requested a private communication with the High Council of the Valerian Empire, the group of ancient beings who made all major decisions for the entire civilization. The humans have issued a threat, he explained to the council. I dismissed it as the posturing of a weak species. However, my analysis of their capabilities suggests something concerning. Their manufacturing technology is primitive, but it is fast. They can produce military vessels in months instead of years. Their population is large and still growing. And they have one quality that our intelligence reports have only recently identified: they are willing to die for their cause. One of the council members, an ancient Valerian named Thex, responded with the kind of dismissive tone that Krell had come to expect. They are threatening us with what? Thousands of inferior vessels? That is barely enough to threaten a single fleet of ours. That was my initial assessment as well, Krell replied carefully. But I have studied their history. Humans have a quality that is rare in the galaxy. They are adaptive. They learn quickly. And, when they are fighting for survival, they become something more dangerous than their technology suggests. I recommend we issue a formal apology for the failure of our protection treaty and offer them significant reparations. The council was silent. The idea that a Valerian commander was recommending backing down from humans was almost unprecedented. But Krell had earned his reputation through victories, and his instincts were rarely wrong. Before the council could vote, another message arrived from Earth. This one was different. It was not a diplomatic message. It was a broadcast, transmitted to every human in the solar system, every human colony throughout space, and every species in the local galactic neighborhood. Sarah Chen, now promoted to admiral, stood before a camera and addressed the galaxy. My name is Sarah Chen. I commanded the colony on Kepler 442b. I watched it die. I watched human children suffocate in their habitats because the air processing systems were destroyed by bombardment. I watched human soldiers stand in the corridors, knowing they were going to die, and stand there anyway, buying time for others to escape. I am standing here now because humanity has decided something. We have decided that we will not be victims. We will not be the weak species that others can attack without consequence. We are going to war. Not because we want to. Not because we think we can win. We are going to war because the alternative is to accept that human life has no value. And we will never accept that. To every human watching this, we are calling you to arms. Not with weapons. With purpose. With determination. With the knowledge that what you do in the next years will determine whether your children will have freedom or will live under the boot of those who think we are acceptable losses. The Valerian Empire made one mistake. They thought we were weak. We are at war now. And they will understand what that means. The broadcast sent shockwaves through human civilization. Within hours, recruitment centers were overflowing. Within days, the human government had activated every reserve, every manufacturing facility, every resource that could be turned toward military production. The humans had made their choice. They were going to fight. And, on his flagship, Commander Krell watched the broadcast and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt fear. Not of the human military. Fear of what humans would become if they decided to commit themselves entirely to war. Fear of a species that had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The High Council made their decision to dismiss his concerns, but Krell knew something that would become clear to everyone else very soon: humanity had just taken its first step toward becoming the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Part 2. 6 months into the conflict, the scale of human response had exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. The human government had converted their entire industrial civilization into a military machine. Factories that had once produced consumer goods were now producing weapons systems. Ships that had carried cargo and passengers were being retrofitted with weapons and armor. A generation of young humans who had never known anything but peace were being trained as soldiers, pilots, and tacticians. Admiral Young stood in the command center of Earth's largest space station, observing the fleet movements with a kind of grim satisfaction. What they were lacking in technological superiority, they were making up for in speed, coordination, and a willingness to take risks that the more conservative Valerian command structure could not match. The Valorians fought according to rules and traditions that had served them well for 3,000 years. Humans fought to survive. The first major engagement of the war had occurred at the Proxima Centauri station, a place where humans and Valorians had shared a research facility. When the shooting started, the human defenders had done something unexpected. Instead of trying to match the Valorians weapon for weapon, they had used their smaller, faster ships to get close to the Valerian vessels, disabling their weapons systems through direct assault and, then, retreating before the Valorians could bring their superior firepower to bear. The Valorians had won the battle, but only barely, and they had lost more ships than they had expected. Word of the engagement spread through the Valerian military command. The humans were not just fighting back. They were innovating. They were finding ways to exploit the weaknesses in Valerian tactics. This was something new. This was something dangerous. Commander Krell was given command of a new task force, with orders to suppress the human expansion in the outer colonies. He approached the task with the respect that one dangerous opponent gives to another. He studied human military history. He learned about their tactics, their strategies, their tendency to adapt and evolve in response to new challenges. What he found was a species that had turned war into an art form, not because they were naturally warlike, but because they had learned that survival required constant innovation. In the human colonies throughout space, the pattern was the same. When Valerian forces attacked, humans retreated, adapted, and then struck back in unexpected ways. They used the terrain of planets to their advantage. They understood supply lines better than the Valorians expected. They were willing to sacrifice ships and soldiers in ways that seemed incomprehensible to a species that valued every member of their civilization. What frustrated the Valerian command most was the speed at which humanity was developing new weapons and tactics. A new human weapon design would appear in combat, and, within weeks, every human fleet would be equipped with it. A new tactic would be tested and proven successful, and it would spread through human space like a contagion. The Valorians were fighting an enemy that was learning, adapting, and improving with terrifying speed. On Earth, the government had declared total war. Every resource was dedicated to the military effort. Scientists and engineers worked around the clock to develop new weapons systems. The universities had been converted into military research facilities. Even the artists and philosophers had found ways to contribute, writing propaganda and speeches that kept the human population focused on the goal of survival. Sarah Chen had become something more than an admiral. She had become a symbol. Every human who saw her face or heard her voice knew that they were fighting for something that mattered. She visited the front lines regularly, speaking to soldiers and pilots, understanding their fears and channeling their anger into purposeful action. She understood something that most military leaders missed: humans fought better when they understood why they were fighting. "The Valorians think this is a war we cannot win," she said in one broadcast that reached millions of humans throughout space. "They are right. We cannot beat them in a direct military confrontation. Our ships are slower. Our weapons are less powerful. Our resources are fewer. But we do not need to beat them in a direct military confrontation. We only need to make the cost of attacking us higher than any empire is willing to pay." This statement became the foundation of human military strategy. They would not try to destroy the Valorian fleet. They would instead make every Valorian attack costly. They would bleed the empire slowly. They would make the occupation of human space so expensive that eventually, the Valorian government would decide it was not worth the effort. This strategy had a name: attrition warfare. And the Valorians had never faced anything like it before. Commander Krell understood the strategy immediately. He recognized it because he had studied it in human history. It was similar to the strategies that human nations had used against each other in their ancient past. And it had one fatal flaw for the side that was trying to implement it: it required the population to be willing to suffer massive casualties for the possibility of eventual victory. Humans were willing to do that. Over the next several months, the Valorian military found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Every system they attacked, humans retreated. Every attack they launched, humans took heavy casualties but survived. And, with each passing day, the human military became more skilled, more experienced, and more dangerous. In the laboratory complexes on Earth, scientists had made a breakthrough. They had found a way to integrate artificial intelligence systems into human weapons platforms. The AI was not as advanced as the systems the Valorians used, but it was fast enough to predict Valorian moves seconds before they happened. It was fast enough to coordinate human fighter squadrons with perfect precision. It was fast enough to find weaknesses in Valorian defensive formations and exploit them with devastating efficiency. Admiral Yang watched the data from the latest engagement with something that looked like pride. A human task force of 300 ships had engaged a Valorian fleet of 150 ships. The humans had lost 110 vessels. The Valorians had lost 87. From a pure mathematical standpoint, this was a Valorian victory. The humans had lost more ships. But the Valorians had also learned something important: every engagement with humans was costing them more ships than they could easily replace. The humans, meanwhile, were manufacturing ships faster than the Valorians could destroy them. The realization slowly began to spread through the Valorian command structure. They were not fighting a war that they could win through military superiority. They were fighting a war that they could only win if the humans decided that the cost was not worth it. And the humans had already decided that they had nothing left to lose. In the High Council chambers, the debate had shifted. The question was no longer whether the Valorians could defeat the humans militarily. The question was whether they should continue trying. The cost was mounting. The political pressure from other factions within the empire was increasing. Some council members argued that they should simply scorch the human homeworld and eliminate the problem entirely. But Thex, the ancient council member who had initially dismissed the humans, now counseled caution. If we attempt to destroy their homeworld, they will resist with everything they have. We would be forced to glass the planet from orbit, killing billions of humans. And, when we did, every species in the galaxy would know that we are capable of genocide. That would make us something worse than we are now. And it would guarantee that if we ever faced another species that was willing to fight like the humans are fighting, there would be no negotiations, no compromises. There would be only total war. The council faced a decision that no Valerian leader had faced before. They could continue fighting, knowing that the costs would keep mounting. Or they could negotiate with a species that had started a war and was somehow winning. The decision, when it came, was made with the kind of grudging respect that one powerful entity gives to another when it finally understands that the other entity refuses to lose. Krell received the message personally. The High Council was offering negotiations. The war would stop. In exchange, the Valorians would formally apologize for the failure to protect the Kepler colony. They would pay massive reparations to the humans. And they would recognize human sovereignty in their territorial space. It was, in essence, a human victory. But, when Krell received the message, he also received a communication from Sarah Chen. The human admiral wanted to meet with him in person, on neutral ground, to discuss the terms of the ceasefire. This was unusual. Military officers on opposing sides rarely met face to face in the middle of a war. But, Krell understood the significance. Sarah Chen was not just accepting the Valerian offer. She was forcing the Valorians to acknowledge her as an equal. They met on a space station that had been established specifically for the negotiations. Sarah Chen was younger than Krell had expected. She had the bearing of a soldier, but there was something else in her eyes. There was the weight of 3,000 deaths. There was the knowledge of all the humans who had been lost fighting this war. And there was the determination of someone who had seen the worst that the galaxy could offer and had refused to break. The Valerian Empire has offered terms, Krell said formally. Your civilization has achieved something remarkable. You have taken a weaker species and turned them into something strong enough to threaten one of the major powers in this galaxy. That is not something that has been accomplished before. Sarah Chen smiled slightly. We did not become strong, Commander. We were always this strong. We just had to be reminded of it. A lot of humans died to learn that lesson. But we learned it. And I think your government has learned it as well. The Council has requested that we negotiate a peace that is permanent and binding, Krell said carefully. I am authorized to offer you the terms I mentioned. But I want to know, what does humanity want that goes beyond these initial terms? Sarah Chen took a moment before answering. Humanity wants the galaxy to understand that we will not be victims. We will not be weak. We will not accept oppression. If the Valerian Empire, or any other power, decides to attack us again, we will respond with everything we have, and we will do it knowing that we have nothing to lose. We will respond like a species that has already died once and decided it did not like the experience. The wars ended, but the changes to the galaxy persisted. The other species that inhabited the known universe had watched a small, young civilization go to war with one of the most powerful empires and somehow survive. They had seen humans lose colony after colony and still keep fighting. They had seen humans develop new weapons and tactics faster than anyone thought possible. And they had seen humans refuse to accept defeat even when victory seemed impossible. From that point forward, humanity was no longer ignored. They were feared. They were respected. They were recognized as one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy, not because of their technology or their numbers, but because they had proven something that every other species understood on an instinctual level: humans would rather die than surrender. Admiral Yang stood in the same command center where he had stood months earlier, watching the final reports of the ceasefire agreement. He understood what had happened. The war was over. But something else had just begun. Humanity had opened a door that could never be closed. They had shown the galaxy what they were capable of. And now, every other species would have to decide how to relate to this new reality. In the celebrations that erupted across human colonies throughout space, the dominant emotion was not joy. It was something deeper. It was the satisfaction of a species that had faced an existential threat and had not just survived, but had proven that they were capable of so much more than anyone, including themselves, had ever believed. Part 3 years had passed since the ceasefire with the Valerian Empire. The galaxy had changed, but perhaps not in the way that many species had expected. Humanity had not become more aggressive. They had become more careful. They had learned that victory came with a cost, and they were determined to prevent the circumstances that would require another war. But they had also learned something else: the galaxy respected strength. The human government had restructured itself completely. The military was now a permanent institution, integrated into every aspect of human civilization. The research and development sector had expanded exponentially, with new weapons systems and defensive technologies being developed at a pace that made other species both envious and nervous. And human society had developed a cultural identity that was centered around one simple idea: never again. Admiral Chen, now the highest-ranking military official in human space, stood before the United Earth Council and presented the annual defense report. The numbers were staggering. Humanity had constructed 17 major space stations. They had built 300 warships. They had trained 500,000 soldiers and pilots. And they had developed weapons systems that, while not matching the Valorians weapon for weapon, had proven to be devastatingly effective in the conditions of actual combat. The question we face now, Chen said, is not whether we are prepared to defend ourselves. We are. The question is what kind of civilization we want to be. Do we want to be a civilization that arms itself for a war that might never come? Or do we want to find a way to maintain our strength while building something better? The debate that followed was one of the most important in human history. The arguments ranged from those who believed that humans should demilitarize and return to peace, to those who believed that humans should continue building their military power until they rivaled the Valorians themselves. But, in the end, a consensus emerged. Humanity would maintain military strength, but they would also begin the work of creating trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic connections with other species. In the Valorian Empire, the reaction to humanity's continued military buildup was mixed. Some council members saw it as a threat. Others saw it as the natural behavior of a species that had been attacked and traumatized. But all of them recognized that humanity had fundamentally changed the balance of power in this region of the galaxy. The Valorians were no longer the only major military power that could enforce their will on other species. Krell had been promoted to a position in the High Council itself, a rare honor for a Valorian military commander. He used his position to advocate for a policy of coexistence with humanity. The humans have proven something to us, he argued before the council. They are not going to disappear. They are not going to become weaker. The only choice we have is to decide whether we want them as enemies or as something else. I recommend we pursue a relationship of respect. The humans are not like other species we have dominated. They fight differently. They think differently. They innovate differently. And they have a capacity for survival that exceeds anything we have encountered before. His recommendation was adopted. The Valorian Empire formally established an embassy on Earth. They began a process of technology sharing with the humans, carefully offering certain technologies that they had previously kept secret. And they began to treat humanity as an equal power rather than as a subject species or a potential enemy. But not every other species in the galaxy responded the same way. A coalition of smaller powers, led by a species called the Threll, decided that humanity's rise had to be stopped. The Threll had their own ambitions for galactic dominance, and humanity represented a threat to those ambitions. They began secretly arming themselves, planning what they believed would be a coordinated strike that would cripple human military capabilities before humans could properly respond. What the Threll did not understand was that humanity had changed in ways that went far beyond their military capabilities. Humanity had developed an intelligence network that rivaled that of the oldest powers in the galaxy. Human scientists had learned to decode alien communications. Human diplomats had developed relationships with dozens of species that allowed them to understand what was happening in every corner of their region of space. When the Threll Coalition began their military preparations, humans knew about it. When they began moving ships into attack positions, humans were ready. And, when they finally launched their coordinated assault on human territory, they discovered something that the Valorians had already learned: the humans were not going to roll over. The humans were not going to accept defeat. The Second War, when it came, lasted only 6 months. It was not a close fight. Humanity had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of threat, and every human military doctrine, every weapon system, every tactical approach had been designed with one purpose: to defeat an enemy before that enemy could do significant damage to human territory. The human fleets that had struggled against the Valorians now moved with a confidence and precision that was almost perfect. The pilots who had died learning how to fight in space had been replaced by a new generation that had been trained by veterans of that earlier conflict. The weapons systems that had been developed in desperation were now refined and deadly. And the human soldiers who went into combat did so with the knowledge that they were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the right of humanity to exist as a free and independent civilization. When the war ended, the Thrall coalition had been completely defeated. The human fleet had suffered casualties, but had also proven something important: they could win decisively when given the right circumstances. They did not need to fight a long, grinding war of attrition. They could destroy an enemy fleet through superior tactics, superior intelligence, and superior willingness to take risks. The galaxy watched this victory with a mixture of admiration and fear. Humanity had not just defended themselves. They had conquered. They had shown that they could project power across interstellar distances. They had shown that they could coordinate complex military operations across multiple star systems. And they had shown that they could do all of this while maintaining the support and loyalty of their population. In the aftermath of the Second War, new negotiations began. This time, the negotiations were not about humans defending themselves against aggression. They were about humans taking their place among the major powers in the galaxy. Krell found himself in a strange position. As a Valorian, he was representing his people in discussions with humans who had proven themselves to be equals. As a military officer, he was forced to respect an enemy that had become an ally. Sarah Chen had become something more than an admiral. She had become the face of human civilization to the rest of the galaxy. When she spoke, other species listened. Not because she was the most powerful. Not because she commanded the largest fleet. But because she represented something that every species understood on an instinctual level: a civilization that had faced existential threats and had not just survived, but had thrived. In her final address to the United Earth Council before stepping down from active military command, Chen spoke about what the war had meant for humanity. "We are no longer the young species that was ignored by the galaxy," she said. "We have been tested. We have been broken. We have been forced to choose between surrender and survival. And we chose survival. That choice has changed us forever. But I want to make sure that we understand what that change means. It does not mean that we are destined to fight endless wars. It does not mean that we should view other species as enemies. It means that we have learned who we are. We are a species that refuses to break. We are a species that will adapt, innovate, and sacrifice to preserve our freedom. And we are a species that will never again accept the idea that our lives have no value." The applause that followed was thunderous. But underneath the celebration, there was a deeper understanding. Humanity had been transformed by war, but not destroyed by it. They had become harder, but not crueler. They had become more focused, but not more rigid. They had become something that the galaxy had never seen before: a young civilization with the knowledge and the will of ancient peoples, combined with the innovation and the adaptability of a species that had nothing to lose. In the decades that followed, humanity continued to grow. They continued to develop their military and their technology. But they also continued to develop their culture, their art, and their philosophy. They established universities and research centers that attracted scholars from dozens of species. They created cultural exchanges that allowed other civilizations to understand what humanity truly was, beyond the military power that had first announced their presence to the galaxy. The legend of humanity spread throughout the galaxy. Other species spoke of how a young civilization had dared to go to war with the Valorian Empire. They spoke of how humans had refused to surrender even when victory seemed impossible. They spoke of how humans had learned and adapted faster than any other species had ever done. And they spoke of how humans had transformed themselves into something stronger, not just militarily, but as a civilization. Years later, in a university on Earth, a young human student asked her professor about the wars, about the ancient conflict that had defined her civilization. The professor, an older human who had served as a pilot in that first war, smiled and explained what had happened. "We made one mistake," he said. "We believed what others told us about ourselves. We believed that we were weak. We believed that we were too fragile, too inexperienced, too unprepared to survive in a galaxy of powerful civilizations. But, when we were tested, we discovered that those beliefs were wrong. We were strong. Not because of our weapons or our ships or our technology. We were strong because we refused to break. And, once we learned that, everything changed." The student asked the final question that every human eventually asked when they learned about the wars: "Do you think it will happen again? Do you think we will have to go to war again?" The old pilot looked out the window of the university, watching the stars beyond Earth's atmosphere. "Yes," he said finally. "Probably we will. Because the galaxy is full of civilizations, and civilizations have ambitions that conflict. But I am not afraid of that future anymore. Because I know what we are capable of. I know that we will face whatever comes with strength and determination. And I know that any power that decides to threaten humanity will face an enemy that refuses to be defeated." That knowledge, more than any weapon, more than any military strategy, was what had truly made humanity dangerous. It was the knowledge that they had been tested and had not broken. It was the knowledge that they could face impossible odds and survive. It was the knowledge that they were capable of becoming something greater than they had ever imagined. One mistake. One declaration of war. And a young civilization had announced to the galaxy that it was no longer going to be ignored, no longer going to be treated as weak, no longer going to accept a role as a victim. Humanity had entered the galactic stage, and they had done so with a fire in their eyes and a determination in their hearts that no power in the galaxy could extinguish. The age of humanity had begun. And the galaxy would never be quite the same.